I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist. I'm a professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies, where I teach eco-psychology, which takes ecology and psychology and puts them together to look at how our relationships to nature, place, and earth affect us internally. And I also have certificates in master gardening through the University of California, as well as sustainable landscaping and permaculture. So I have a list of questions that I want to get to, and they all hover around this really important concept of eco-anxiety, which is something that's affecting more and more of us. And the questions that I want to answer in this brief video are, what is eco-anxiety? How is it different from ordinary anxiety? What's the mental and physical impact of climate change, which is what's behind all this? What do people who suffer eco-anxiety go through? Who's mainly affected by it? And I have some recommendations at the end for how to deal with this. So I want to start by saying that I really dislike this word eco-anxiety, and I'm using it because it's the buzzword now, and it's the way to communicate important things about this topic. But the reason I dislike the word is that what it really means is fear. Rational, justifiable, logical fear about degrading ecosystems and rising temperatures all over the planet. It's a rational response to what's happening. It's not just anxiety. Anxiety is usually a normal state of at least part of being human. We might feel anxious about this or that, and sometimes when our anxiety gets out of control, we need to go and get help for it. There's medical reasons for that and so on. This is different. This is different, and that's why there's no individually oriented therapy for eco-anxiety, because there's no therapy that's been designed for planetary catastrophe. If there were an asteroid hurtling toward the Earth right now with an impact predictable, nobody would be saying, is there a form of therapy I can use so that I don't have to feel so anxious? Everybody would be mobilizing. Everybody would be saying, we've got to save what we can save in the face of this catastrophe, right? So eco-anxiety is similar in its relation to climate change. Global warming, that's the real problem. People are simply having emotional reactions to it. So there is ways of getting support with those reactions, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more at the end of this video. But my colleague, the ecologist Stephen Harding, with typical British humor, likes to say, and it's true, you know, therapy really isn't for eco-anxiety. If you are seeing the news about what's happening and you're not upset, you need to go into therapy to figure out why you're not upset. That's what you should be using it for, right? So in terms of the impact, the physical impact is so profound and it's so current now. It's not in the future, it's happening now, that I can only touch on a few things. So people dying in heat waves, that's a real obvious example. The heat wave that went through Europe in 2015 killed more than 3,000 people. There are deaths from power outages. Here in California, our utility company has told us that when the winds kick up, they may need to cut the power to make sure there's no fires like the ones that burned up California over the last 2 years. Those killed people. So imagine being in 105 degrees or even hotter, and there's no air conditioning. So people die from heat exposure as well. More and more of that happening. Massive displacement, weather-related injuries, more about that in a second. It's so bad that the Australian Medical Society, or excuse me, Association, has said recently that global warming is actually a health emergency, a planetary health emergency, and a number of other medical associations are getting on board with that, finally. So as far as some mental effects go, there's been increasing numbers of studies on this since 2015, and not only higher anxiety because of changing climate, but also higher rates of aggression. When there's really bad droughts, farmers kill themselves. 900 in the Midwest a few years back. Farmers in India, other countries too, so they're casualties. Post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and helplessness are also in the list. In 2016, the American Psychological Association published some commentary on a global report, and it had to do with weather-related impact on mental health, so things like Katrina, those sorts of disasters, which hit the economically disadvantaged the hardest. but they affect everybody who's in the path. So children, pregnant women, postpartum women, people with a pre-existing mental illness, the poor, homeless, and first responders are all at higher risk for any kind of psychological injury from this, but it affects everybody. The estimates now are that at least half of people exposed to what used to be thought of as an extreme weather event suffer some kind of mental health effect. 50% of adults and 45% and children, actually both together, suffer depression after a natural disaster. So there are significant mental health effects from climate change, and also related to eco-anxiety, which, like I said, is actually fear. But that's a short list. There's many more. So when people have this, when people have eco-anxiety, often they go through what Linda Bazell and Sarah Edwards, both psychologists, both ecotherapists, refer to as stages of awakening. So a lot of us start out in denial, where we just can't believe that things are the way they are. Maybe we're, defending against whatever the news is telling us, defending against it psychologically, distracting ourselves or what have you. And there's often a moment where a particular news story or some local event, because all of this is increasingly local now, gets our attention and we have a moment of shock. So we move from denial to shock. And then from there, all kinds of feelings come up. Sometimes helplessness, sorrow at everything that's being lost, anger at who's responsible. And it's a process. And at the end of it, if we get the support that we need and find a sense of purpose, then the anxiety, so-called, doesn't go away, but at least we have a direction. And at that point, after going through these, what they call stages of awakening, we come to a place where we say, okay, what can I do? How can I help with this? So that's a much better place to be, a good place to be. In terms of who is mainly affected by this, I mentioned earlier, it's under-resourced communities. Physically affected too. They're the ones that can least afford to get wiped out by storms and droughts and drying up water supplies and everything else that's happening. So they get hit the hardest. Having said that, though, I should mention that now it's everywhere. Those communities get it the worst, but now everybody's suffering. So even people watching the news report that they have some significant level of fear about what's actually happening. But in terms of direct impact, I was working at a school near Montecito when the mudslides happened. There was a big fire, the Thomas Fire, that burned off all the brush from the hills, and all of it came down in mudslides when there was a storm a few weeks later. So 23 people, and the people who were killed were in Montecito, which is an upper class enclave. So everybody's vulnerable now. And that's a fact of life that we're in permanently. So other things that we should talk about. One thing I wouldn't do in terms of managing yourself and taking care of yourself in all this changing climate, changing circumstances and all that, I wouldn't waste time debating people who don't get it. Unless you're a professional and that's your job. But even then, I wouldn't spend a lot of time doing it because they're not going to get it. Anybody who's in denial at this point isn't going to get it. There's been good science since 2015 that we're overheating the planet. It has been massively accumulating since then, and things have gone so far now that pretty much anywhere in the world, if you even go outside and you're the least bit aware of your senses and your surroundings, you can feel that the world is different. The world is changing. It doesn't take science to tell us that, but plenty of science does. And some people who are still in denial raise the point at times, well, there's some scientists that say that global warming is not human caused, So somebody handed me a report once that had a lot of those on there, a lot of the disconfirming studies. So I looked up the sources of the funders, and they were all petroleum companies, right? That's not supposed to matter in terms of funding scientific studies, but it does matter. The disconfirming voices are bought and paid for, right, to create doubt. So at this point, to argue with people who don't get that the world is overheating is kind of like trying to argue with somebody who calls in on a morning talk show and says, there are purple ponies that are swimming around in my morning coffee. How do I get rid of them? You're not going to debate somebody like that and succeed, so don't even bother. What I would do instead, though, is I would get support from people, like-minded people who know what's going on with the world and with rising temperatures, and who are also concerned about it and feel eco-fear, not just anxiety. So there's support groups that are available for this. One that comes to mind is the Good Grief people. Good Grief is available for that. There's circles all over the place now, but they're a good organization. And then, so this is a two-step. So the first step is to get some kind of support and just check in with other people because it's too big to do alone, right? It's not an ordinary inner conflict that you can manage just by having good psychological tools. This is a planetary catastrophe in slow motion unfolding. So link up with other people so you can get the emotional support and education that you need. The second recommendation is to find organizations that support your values in terms of honoring Earth and trying to at least mitigate the effects of climate change, because it's beyond the point where we're going to reverse it. So there are international organizations like 350.org. There is Defend Our Future, who were supporters of the 4 million person climate strike that happened yesterday all over the world. Lots of really good groups out there. Locally, there's a group I really like too. So look locally. They're called Planting Justice. They're based in Oakland. And they not only create gardens to grow healthy food and teach the community how to do that, but they're into things like social justice. They work with incarcerated people to get them on their feet and doing something productive. And I like to think of them as a kind of blueprint for the sort of diverse and inclusive and just forms of culture that we're going to need at the ground level to get through what's coming and what's already unfolding. So those kinds of community groups, if they can grow and then link up, then that's helpful. What I would also recommend doing is, in order to stop from feeling overwhelmed by all of it, because it's so huge, try to center your awareness on something that really gets into your heart. So for some people, an aspect of all of this will be the actual climate. For other people, it might be animal welfare. For still other people, it might be clean food. For somebody else, it might be childhood advertising. One of the reasons we're in this situation is because, especially in the West, but increasingly other areas, we massively consume enormous resources, more than the planet can actually sustain. And so that is driving a lot of this. And so in countries like the United States, it's still permissible for advertisers to direct their attention directly onto children who can't withstand that. And so undoing that, fighting against that is a good cause. There's lots of different ways to find something that really arouses your sense of care and do that, because if you work on that, in a sense you're working on the whole system. You're working on a part of an entire network of things that are driving climate change. So in that way, when you work diligently on one thing, you're helping all of them. And so my last suggestion would be to find some opportunities to go outside in places that are safe and that have some nature left in them, and reconnect with it, with plants, animals, landscapes, whatever's around you, whatever you have access to, and really be out there consciously with all that and start learning about it, start getting into it, because we don't protect what we don't love. And nature isn't just national parks. Nature is your backyard. Nature is your body, right? So the more you can reconnect with that at a conscious level, the more tuned in you're going to be. And the added benefit of all this is there's a ton of scientific research that shows that doing that kind of conscious reconnection with the natural world is healthy on many levels. It decreases anxiety, it decreases anger, it helps people get along with each other, it's good for your mood, it helps your blood pressure, and so on and so forth. So there's an added benefit to that kind of reconnection too. So those are a few things that you can do as we head down a path that is going to become increasingly rocky, but I think that we're going to get through. Thanks.